Well, good morning, Deb.
Good morning, Doug.
How
It's
are
a
you?
pleasure to be on this video with you and
Well,
to be on your advisory group.
thank you. And it's a pleasure to be with you this morning, talking about your chief executive leadership at MASA. Why don't we begin, Deb, by your telling us a bit about your professional background and about MASA?
Happy to do that. It's an honor to be the executive director of MASA. I'm one of the lucky ones. I was a teacher. I was an assistant principal, a principal, an executive director, a chief of staff, and finally a superintendent. So I worked my way up through education into administration. And I taught social studies to high school age kids. And I also was an advisor to many different activities. I really enjoyed the experience of teaching. And then I became an assistant principal at both the middle and high school levels before becoming a high school principal in an urban setting. I was at a school that there was about 2,500 students, very diverse. High poverty rate, and one of the best experiences of my life. The kids were absolutely fantastic, and so was the staff. And then from there, I was promoted into the cabinet at St. Paul Public Schools under Dr. Harvey's leadership. Pat Harvey was a phenomenal superintendent in St. Paul. She came to St. Paul from Chicago. Unfortunately, she has recently passed away, but I tell you that she was one fantastic leader, and I was fortunate that she promoted me to the executive director position of all the alternative learning programs in St. Paul Public School, and also on the opposite end to early kindergarten. She had received a school district had received a grant from the Bush Foundation to begin a program for students as young as 4 years old. And she asked me if I would lead that program. And I told her at the time I didn't have any experience with that age level. And she said, I just need a good leader to get the program off the ground. So it was quite an honor that she respected my leadership that much. So I worked that position, and then I finished my career as chief of staff of St. Paul Public Schools, and then went to be a superintendent for 13 years in North Branch area public schools, which is about 45 minutes north of the Twin City area.
You have done it all. Why don't you tell us a bit about MASA?
Thank you. MASA is an organization that has 6 component groups. The primary component group is the superintendent group. That's our largest group. But we also have curriculum leaders, technology leaders, higher ed staff. We have special education directors, we have leaders of cooperatives, and we have assistant superintendents. We have over 600 active members, and we have many retired members who still participate in MASA. We're a strong leader in the state, and we do encompass the entire state. Superintendents from every region of the state belong to MASA. We provide professional development for our members. We also provide advocacy efforts for our members. So at both the state and national level, we are very fortunate to have such great leaders in our state, and we do whatever we can through MASA to support their needs.
Well, great. Thank you for that background. Now, what prompted you after years as a very successful superintendent, and of course you held a number of other positions in public education. What led you to, or prompted you to take on the challenge of leading a major state association?
Well, I can tell you that I tell others it took me about 4 months to decide whether or not I should even apply for the position. I was tapped on the shoulder early on when the former executive director, Gary Amoroso, announced his retirement. And I was tapped on the shoulder frequently by females. MASA has been in existence since 1907, and I am the first female executive director.
Oh.
So there were a number of women who thought it was time that a woman be appointed as an executive director. And I really appreciated that tapping on my shoulder. And I will also say that I waited until there were male colleagues that also tapped me on the shoulder. One individual called me and said he was calling on behalf of a number of other male superintendents. And that got me thinking. So I had both support from males and females, which I would definitely need, obviously, if I were to lead this organization. And then I thought about all the experiences that I had as a superintendent and assistant superintendent, so to speak, in St. Paul when I was a member of MASA. They were so supportive of me and of my efforts, and I always found solace in whatever I did with MASA. So I took the time to think about the position and whether or not my skill set matched. I had been president of MASA. I had been superintendent of the year through MASA, and I knew the staff and that they did great work. And so I decided, well, I have some support out there and people are thinking that I have the skills necessary. So I will apply, and the rest is history. I was very fortunate and honored to be invited to be the next executive director of MASA. And that was in the year 2019, previous to the pandemic. I was announced as the new executive director, I believe the end of January, early February. And then as we know, the nation pretty much went into shutdown in March of 2019.
You took the helm at a very challenging time. As you prepared to take the helm at MASA, what did you think would be your unique value added as its new executive director, its new chief executive officer, and what specific CEO leadership targets did you have in mind?
I thought I could add value to the organization, given my recent experience as a superintendent. I had worked with special ed directors, curriculum leaders, and obviously other superintendents. And so I knew that would be a value, and superintendents would be glad that I could speak their same language, as would others in the education field. I also thought I would bring value in that I have what I consider to be emotional intelligence. I'm pretty steady when we need to be steady, and I can get excited when the issue of the day calls for excitement. And so I'm a steady leader, and I also like to bring people to the table. I believe that if you have the right people at the table, you can solve almost any issue. And I think I have a knack for knowing who needs to be at the table. Also, I worked in suburban, urban, and rural districts, so I knew what the issues were in a smaller district as opposed to a suburban district of Minneapolis and St. Paul. And then having worked in the urban setting of St. Paul, that also gave me wonderful experiences to share with my colleagues. So I thought the diversity of my career would be really beneficial. And then my leadership style of being steady and being reliable and dependable and hardworking, sometimes way too hardworking, but that those would be benefits that other members would see as worthwhile and seek me out as their leader.
What specific CEO leadership targets did you have in mind as you took the helm?
Well, I had a target to reach out to the various component groups and involve them more in the organization. And I still continue to work on that because some of the component groups are smaller than others. Sometimes it's harder to reach them, and they're not always included in some of the regional meetings. So that is one of the targets that I had as a leader was to be more inclusive and to make sure that I touched every member in our organization, and also try to find out what it was that their needs were. So I had focus groups to start my executive director role, and I learned from them what their needs were. So one of my CEO leadership skills I believe that I was targeting was being responsive to the needs of members. So I created a number of networks, one for BIPOC members, one for female leaders. This year, we're going to start one for instructional leaders network. And so I really worked hard to find out what gaps there might have been in MASA support, and tried to instill actionable items into our plan for the future so that we could meet the needs of the members.
So, Deb, now 3 years or so
I'm
into
two. Yep, two. Mhm.
2 years or so on the job. What have you found significantly different between leading a school district as a superintendent and being chief executive of an association? How are the leadership challenges different?
I think the relationships are much different because as an executive director of the superintendents and other component group members organization, those individuals join voluntarily. And so whatever you offer, it is in the spirit of you can do this if you want, you do not have to do this if you want. So it's much different than when you're in a school district and, for example, you choose a new curriculum. We can recommend curriculums, we can recommend other pieces that affect educators, but that's all we're doing is recommending, and we know that we're working with volunteers. For example, my board of directors is all volunteer individuals, and I'm grateful to each one of them. They don't get a stipend. All they get is a good dinner a couple of times a year. And they are just wonderfully supportive, but it's different than an elected school board that goes back to their constituents and faces re-election every year. My board of directors don't face re-election every year. There's a term limit for them. There isn't a term limit in Minnesota for school board members. So there's a different feeling that they project with how they treat their members as opposed to how school board members treat their members. So it's a different situation as an executive director of an organization like this, knowing that what you are sharing is voluntary. And again, you're dealing with volunteer leadership. There are people that would like me to mandate specific actions that our members take, but I always remind them, it is entirely up to our members as whether or not they accept this professional development or if they accept this belief statement. It is not something that we are going to direct or mandate for them to do. So it's much different than running a school district in that way.
You've said a bit about the differences between a school board and an association board. You mentioned how they're elected and or chosen. What other differences have you noticed? How is it different for you working with an association board as opposed to a school board?
Well, the school board makes decisions that the association board does not have to make. They do make similar decisions in that there's budget concerns, there's policy issues, but the school board's scope of governance goes beyond what is necessary for an organization like mine. School boards right now are grappling with all the issues with COVID. We don't grapple with those issues in the association's governing board. We don't have to make determinations about vaccines and masking, though we do make decisions about recommendations for masking and such at our conferences. But the school board's scope of governance is far reaching compared to the association. I don't bring to them necessarily issues that a typical school board might face. Like, for example, they have to do a truth in taxation hearing. We don't do that kind of thing on the association. We do plan to sell our building, and that will go before my board of directors to ensure that I have a positive vote. They have already determined that I should explore that idea, but when I choose a realtor, they will definitely take board action to approve it. So some of the governing pieces are similar, but they're just not at the scope that they are at an elected school board. And we don't have to have open meetings. We do have open meetings, but we don't have the public attending, which is way different than the typical school board meeting.
Yes.
And in most of our school boards have a way for public comment to happen from their constituents that are taxpayers or live in the district or have kids in the district. We don't have that. We don't have a region other than the whole state. And we are not beholden to our constituents to come in and to publicly share their thoughts and views with our association board. So much different environment. It's one where we can certainly discuss the issues facing the organization like you would at a typical school board meeting, but not one where they feel public pressure like a typical school board member might feel, especially in this day and age where there is so much division over some of the directions that school boards and superintendents make.
What have you enjoyed most about being an association CEO?
Well, I have to share, Doug, that COVID has brought a different way of doing business to the organization. So typically the executive officer would travel to, we have the state divided into 9 different regions, would travel 3 times to each region every year, fall, winter, and spring. Well, that's changed. Our superintendent colleagues and others in the association have generally met on a weekly basis virtually, and they have invited me. And so it has been wonderful to meet with them on a much more regular basis. So I've really enjoyed getting to know the members on a different level than I perhaps would have if I had only went out to the regions 3 times. That seems insufficient now when I think about it. It worked well as an MASA member. That's what I expected. And I didn't think I was getting shortchanged in any way. But now that I have been in weekly meetings with my members, I know the value of that frequent and constant contact. I also have had the pleasure of working much more closely with state department officials and the governor. I have very limited amount rather with the governor, but I have been able to contact the governor's office and say, I believe you might want to have an audience with our members, and have joined with the Minnesota School Boards Association a couple of times to have him address our members around difficult issues that are happening as a result of COVID. But I'm very closely in communication with our state commissioner of education, and a little bit less so with the commissioner of health. But the commissioner of education is very responsive, and I formed a great relationship with her and the commissioner of health. And I feel I can reach out to them at any time, share member concerns, and get a really very quick and timely response, which is much to their credit. They are really very skilled leaders, and I didn't expect how closely I would work with the Department of Education. And I don't think if it wasn't for COVID that I would work as closely as I have, but there have been so many changes, as you know, over the past 2 years, is it almost, that we have been in this pandemic, and our leaders have had so many questions, and they have looked to me to carry the water on those issues, whether it be prep time for teachers, whether it be online learning issues, or anything related to ESSER funding and the ARP Act. They've trusted me to carry those issues forward and to be responsive. And then in those weekly meetings, I can let them know what I'm hearing. So I can do this just as you and I are interviewing now. I can always use email communication or pick up the phone and call someone. But those weekly meetings have really proven to be a route of communication that I didn't anticipate having when I became the executive director. And I would certainly recommend them to anybody that is considering a position like an executive director in the future.
Yeah, I'm going to throw in a question we didn't discuss, if I may, that occurs to me with reference to your board at MASA. As you look back over your 2 years as the CEO, what significant governing accomplishment of your board would you point to? What stands out as what you might call a governing achievement of the board?
The board just recently approved an equity statement, a racial equity definition, and an equity definition. So those three pieces were significant accomplishments. When I was offered this position, I was offered the position with the caveat that I would move equity work forward in our state. And I said that I would do that. And I have been working very hard with our governing board to ensure that we give our leaders what they need. So they recently passed, as I mentioned, an equity statement for the organization and two definitions, racial equity and equity. And then, like other elected school boards, they just recently approved a draft continuous improvement plan. And the continuous improvement plan has 5 belief statements in it, along with the equity statement and the racial and equity definitions, the 5 belief statements, and then some action items. So those two, and then I would say definitely the decision to sell our building was a significant governing decision, because the building had been within MASA's ownership since the 1980s. And there has been a significant amount of work identified that needs to be done. And because our staff has been working virtually since the pandemic began, and we have worked successfully, our governing board decided that the cost of the repairs did not, they said it was a money pit, to be frank, that it just did not prove to be valuable enough to fix up that building. So I would say those 3 things, the equity work, the continuous improvement plan that will be reviewed annually rather than like a 5-year strategic plan, and then the sale of the building, are 3 very important pieces of governance work that the board carried out. And of course, I provided them with information along the way, like the sale of the building. I let them know what the building cost us on an annual basis. I let them know what the estimate of repairs was. I let them know a broker statement of value, so they had that information. And then with the continuous improvement plan, that's been a process since I led those focus group meetings along with my colleague, Director of Professional Learning, Mia Urick. We gathered all that information, provided the feedback for that. And I have also a steering committee that is made up of the various members of the various component groups that help me with the equity definitions and the belief statements. And so all of this has been communicated to them prior to them having to make any significant decisions, just like you would as a good superintendent would. You always want your board to come in well prepared with good information so they can make an informed decision.
So how did you go about, I'm throwing in another question we hadn't chatted about, but how did you go about building your partnership with the board chair when you came on board, when you took the helm? What steps did you take to?
Sure. The board chair in our case is the president. And so the president and I met twice a month, just the 2 of us individually. And I would create the agenda, and he also had editing rights, and he could add whatever he chose to put on there. And so for the first year, I met again with the president twice a month. I also meet regularly with the executive officers, and the executive officers include the treasurer, the president-elect, the president, and the past president. So there's 4 of them. So we meet more regularly than the board of directors. The board of directors only officially, the 26th, meets 3 times a year. No, let's see. 1, 2, 3. Yeah, 3 times a year. And then I meet with the executive officers probably 8 to 10 times a year. I no longer meet with the president. I have a different president this year, and together we decided that we would have discussion as needed. And so I reach out to him, or he reaches out to me. But that first year, I know that the president wanted to help set me up for success. And so we met, as I mentioned, twice a month, and that really was helpful. And he would tell you that he enjoyed our meetings just as much as I did, because he could let me, he would give me a temperature check from what he was hearing from members. And, that's really important for a leader to have that temperature check, because some people let you know how they feel very directly about your leadership, and others will be much more cautious or hesitant to do so. So he was really valuable in helping me get off to a good start.
So actually, then you've adapted with the second president you've worked with to a different style
Correct.
of communication, which
That's right. Mm-hmm.
experience has taught me is really critical, because no two presidents are going to be exactly alike in how they communicate and interact. Well, I have a closing question. You'll be happy to know your day will get better in just a few minutes. If you were counseling superintendents who were thinking about taking on the challenge of being an association executive, what would you recommend to them in terms of preparing them? What attributes would you tell them they need to have or need to develop to succeed?
I would say, and I've always said this as a leader, is you need to be able to work with all people, because you are going to be working with not only people that are in a variety of educational positions, but you're going to be working with people of a variety of political views, and you are going to be working with legislators and representatives in Congress that have different political views, and you always need to advance the cause of the organization. So it's sometimes you're working with people that you might not share the same political view, and other times you do, and you have to be prepared to represent all of your members and to be as bipartisan as you possibly can. And if that is not something you can do, I would say in my position, the job is not for you. Because I can tell you that I worked well with a Republican leader in our state legislature who chaired the House, the Senate Education Committee, and then the House Education Finance Committee was led by a Democrat. So I worked with both, and I felt equally successful with both, and I will continue to do that. So I feel you have to work with all people and with all political views, and if you don't do that, people are going to not be happy with your leadership style, because it's not going to meet their needs. So that would be one piece of advice. And then the other piece of advice would be, how much history do you have with the association? If you have history with the association, you've been a part of committee work, or you have been an executive officer, then you really need to give it a close look as to whether or not you want to make that leap. I feel that it was extraordinarily beneficial, and especially in this time of COVID. And here's my example. I have been in only a couple of meetings with my entire staff. We have worked remotely this entire time. And if I had not known them previously, I think that might have been more difficult. But and hopefully no executive director will face that situation again. But with the sale of our office building, we are only going to lease meeting space and just a couple of offices. So we plan to work long into the future remotely, because it has been successful. So I would just say that if you have history with the organization, to think about it carefully. And if you don't have any history with the organization, then why do you want to lead it? If you have not been a part of a committee, if you have not been a part of a focus group, or if you have not been a part of the advocacy at the days at the Capitol, for example, what is causing you to want to be involved with that organization? That would make me wonder. And then the final thing, as I mentioned earlier, is emotional intelligence. Knowing when and what emotion to display at the right time is really critical for leaders to be successful. No matter if you're an executive director, or you're a principal, a teacher, it's something that is developed over time, and something I pride myself in, being able to match my emotions to whatever the situation calls for.
Well, Deb, I really appreciate you taking the time to discuss your work at MASA. I know how busy you are, so I am grateful. And are there any closing comments you'd like to make before we head into our respective days?
Sure. I'm just grateful to you, Doug, for this opportunity, as I mentioned at the start, to be a part of the advisory group, but also to your work with helping new leaders and seasoned leaders understand the role of boards. Board work is difficult for superintendents at times. I can tell you, I had 25 different board members in my 13 years. I always teased that I held the record in the state, and maybe I did at that time. But board members would come and go. Some would come in trying to fix our financial situation and then realize it wasn't very fixable without state support, and getting state support was really a challenge. So I appreciate all that you are doing to try to shed light on what a good governance model is and how, high functioning school boards can really make a difference.
Well, thank you. And thank you for giving the time to chat with me today. And I do look forward to working with you as a member of the Strategic Advisory Committee of our blog. I'm sure most of our viewers know it's boardsavvysuperintendent.com. So you have a very good day and a good week since it's Monday today.
Thank you so much. And I know we'll be in touch. Take good care. Bye-bye.